The snow crunched beneath my boots as I stood there, staring at the impossible. 50,000 gallons. American fuel drums, stacked like monuments to our defeat, stretching as far as my frozen eyes could see. December 1944, and here I was, Oberleutnant Klaus Reinhardt, 26 years old, standing in a Belgian forest, clearing with enough gasoline to push our Panzers all the way to Antwerp. My hands were shaking, but not from the cold. Around me, my men were cheering, slapping each other's backs, their breath forming clouds in the bitter air. They thought we had won something. They thought this was victory. But as I looked at those drums, each one stamped with the bold letters of the United States Army, I felt something break inside my chest, because I understood what they could not see. This fuel depot, this treasure we had just captured, was nothing to the Americans. Nothing. They had left it here, unguarded, almost carelessly, because they had so much more where this came from. And we had sent our last reserves, our final desperate thrusts, just to reach it. In that moment, surrounded by jubilation, I knew the war was over. We had already lost 6 days earlier, on December 16th, 1944, I had been briefed in a farmhouse near the German border. The walls were covered in maps, the air thick with cigarette smoke and the desperate hope of men who knew they were gambling everything on a single hand. Operation Wacht am Rhein, they called it. Watch on the Rhine. Hitler's grand plan to split the Allied forces, drive to Antwerp, cut off their supplies, and force a negotiated peace in the West so we could focus all our strength against the Soviets in the East. I had commanded a Panzer company since Normandy, or what was left of it, 3 Tigeries, 5 Panthers, and about 80 men, most of them teenagers who had never seen combat before. The veterans, the real soldiers, they were all dead or crippled or lost somewhere in the endless retreat from France. The briefing officer, a major whose name I have long forgotten, spoke with a kind of fervor that comes from desperation masked as confidence. We would attack through the Ardennes Forest, he said, where the American line was weakest. The weather would be on our side, thick fog and snow that would ground their aircraft and neutralize their air superiority. We would move fast, capture fuel depots along the way because our own supply lines could not support such a deep penetration, and we would reach the Meuse River within 4 days. 4 days to change the course of the war. I remember looking around the room at the other officers. Some were nodding, their eyes bright with possibility. Others, like me, said nothing. We had all seen what the Americans could do. We had watched their endless columns of trucks, their swarms of fighter bombers, the way their artillery could flatten entire grid squares in minutes. But orders were orders, and we were German officers, and we would do our duty, even if that duty was to march into oblivion. The morning of December 16th came with a darkness that felt eternal. At 5:30 a.m., every German gun along an 85-mile front opened fire simultaneously. The sound was apocalyptic, a rolling thunder that shook the ground and made the trees shed their snow in ghostly cascades. I stood in the cupola of my Tiger II, watching the western horizon light up with muzzle flashes and explosions. For 30 minutes, we poured everything we had into the American positions. Then the barrage lifted, and we moved forward. The forest was like something from a nightmare. Narrow roads covered in ice. Trees so thick that our tanks could barely maneuver. My breath froze on my scarf, turned to ice crystals that cut my face. We could hear the Americans calling to each other in the fog ahead, confused, trying to understand what was happening. The first day went better than we had any right to expect. The American line, held mostly by green divisions resting from previous battles, collapsed in several places. We pushed forward, sometimes 10 miles, sometimes 15. My company captured a road junction near a village called Lent, and I remember seeing American soldiers running through the snow without their weapons, just running, their faces white with shock. By nightfall, we had penetrated 6 miles into their lines, and for a few hours, I let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, this insane gamble might work. But then the fuel gauges started dropping toward empty, and reality returned like a fist to the stomach. The second and third days became a nightmare of a different kind. The fog lifted occasionally, and when it did, the American fighter bombers came, P-47 Thunderbolts, screaming out of the low clouds, their wings sparkling with rocket fire. I lost one of my Tigers to a direct hit, watched it brew up in a pillar of black smoke while the crew burned alive inside. The Americans were bringing up reinforcements faster than we could advance. Suddenly, there were paratroopers, the 101st Airborne, dug in around a town called Bastogne that we desperately needed to capture. Our advance slowed to a crawl. Every crossroads became a battleground, every farm a fortress, and always, the fuel situation became more critical. We were siphoning from destroyed vehicles, rationing every drop, knowing that if our tanks stopped moving, we were dead. On the 5th day, my company was detached from the main thrust and sent on a flanking mission. Intelligence reported an American fuel depot near the village of Stavelet, lightly guarded, ripe for capture. 20,000 gallons, they said. Enough to keep our entire battle group moving for another 2 days. My orders were simple. Take it, hold it, and wait for the supply convoy to come forward and redistribute the fuel. We moved through the night, our engines rattling in the cold, every man tense and silent. The forest was full of American stragglers, lost units, destroyed vehicles. We could hear fighting in every direction, but in our little column, there was only the grinding of gears and the squeaking of frozen tracks on snow. We reached the depot at dawn on December 22nd. It was larger than intelligence had reported, much larger. A clearing in the forest, maybe 200 yards across, filled with fuel drums, not 20,000 gallons. 50,000, maybe more. There were only a dozen American soldiers guarding it, engineers mostly, and they surrendered almost immediately when my Tigers emerged from the tree line. No shots fired, no heroic last stand. They just put their hands up, their faces showing more relief than fear. One of them, a sergeant with a southern accent, actually smiled at me. "You boys are welcome to it," he said in broken German. "We got plenty more." That's when it hit me, not like a thought, but like a physical blow. I walked among those fuel drums, hundreds of them, all marked with fresh dates, all filled to capacity. My men were already rolling them toward our vehicles, laughing, celebrating our incredible luck. But I was doing mathematics in my head. 50,000 gallons, a fortune to us. Our entire offensive had been planned around capturing fuel because we did not have enough to sustain it. We had scraped together every drop from the Reich, emptied reserve depots, and it still was not enough. And here was an American depot, left with a token guard, containing enough fuel to run my small company for months. Juan de Pau. The Americans had logistics bases across France, Belgium, and Holland. They had pipelines bringing fuel from the coast. They had tanker trucks by the thousands. This depot, this treasure that meant everything to us, was a rounding error to them. I thought about the briefing 6 days earlier, about the confident voices explaining how we would capture Allied fuel depots to sustain our offensive. The plan had required us to capture enemy supplies because we could not provide our own. What kind of army plans an offensive based on stealing from the enemy? What kind of nation was Germany that we had to gamble everything on such desperation? I looked at my young soldiers, their faces bright with hope, and I wanted to scream at them. I wanted to tell them that this fuel meant nothing, that we had already lost, that every mile we advanced was just a mile farther from home when the inevitable counterattack came. But I said nothing. I was their officer. My job was to give them courage, not truth. We held that depot for 2 days while engineers worked to transfer the fuel into our vehicles and into barrels that could be transported back to our lines. During those 2 days, the weather cleared completely. The fog lifted, the snow stopped, and the skies became a brilliant, terrible blue. And with that clear weather came the full weight of American air power. I had seen it before in Normandy, but never like this. They came in waves, hundreds of them, fighters and bombers covering the sky like a swarm of mechanical locusts. They were not even targeting us specifically. We were too small, too insignificant. They were hitting everything German that moved. Every road, every crossing, every village where our forces gathered. I stood in that clearing on December 23rd, watching the contrails high above, listening to the distant rumble of bombs falling on my comrades to the west and north, and I understood with absolute clarity that we had stepped into a trap. The Ardennes offensive was not bold or brilliant. It was suicide. We had thrown our last reserves, our final generation of young men, our remaining tanks and guns, into an offensive that could never succeed because the fundamental arithmetic of the war had become impossible to deny. Germany was out of fuel, out of steel, out of time. America had all three in such abundance that they could leave 50,000 gallons sitting in a forest with a dozen guards. On December 24th, Christmas Eve, The Americans counterattacked nearby. We could hear it, the massive artillery preparation, the roar of tank engines. My radio man intercepted American communications. They were casual, almost bored, calling in airstrikes like ordering groceries, coordinating armor movements with the kind of ease that comes from having more resources than you know what to do with. That night, I gathered my officers in a half-ruined barn. We still had the fuel. We still had operational vehicles. Our orders were to continue west to link up with the main thrust. But I could see in their eyes that they knew what I knew. We were already ghosts. Christmas morning, 1944, was brutally cold and absolutely clear. Perfect flying weather. The American aircraft came at first light, and they came for us specifically this time. Someone had finally noticed our fuel depot. The first bombs fell while my men were having their Christmas breakfast. Thin soup and hard bread. I was in my command tank when the P-47s came screaming over the treetops. Their rockets turning the depot into an inferno within seconds. 50,000 gallons went up in a mushroom cloud that must have been visible for 20 miles. The heat was so intense that trees 100 yards away caught fire. I lost 30 men in the first minute, burned alive or torn apart by shrapnel. The Americans made 3 more passes, methodically destroying every vehicle, every fuel barrel, everything we had worked to secure. When they finally left, I climbed out of my tank and walked through the devastation. The snow had melted in a wide circle around the burning depot, revealing the brown earth beneath. My beautiful Tiger II, the most advanced tank in the world, sat there uselessly, out of fuel, surrounded by the smoking remains of the fuel we had captured and lost. The irony was so perfect it was almost funny. We had marched into Belgium to capture American fuel. We had found more than we could have dreamed, and now it was gone. And we were stranded 40 miles behind enemy lines with no way home. I made the decision then. I gathered the survivors, maybe 40 men out of the 80 I had started with. I told them we were going to walk east, back toward German lines, and we were going to abandon the vehicles. Some of them protested. You do not abandon a Tiger II. It is not done. But I was beyond caring about such things. I knew that in days, maybe hours, American armor would roll through here and capture or destroy our tanks anyway. Better to save the men than die beside useless machines. We sabotaged the vehicles, pulled the breech blocks from the guns, drained what little fuel remained onto the ground, then we started walking. The retreat took 6 days and it broke us. Not the fighting. There was surprisingly little of that. But the cold, the hunger, the knowledge that we were running from an enemy who was not even really pursuing us because we were so irrelevant. We saw the full scale of the offensive's failure as we moved east. Burned out German vehicles lined every road. Abandoned equipment lay half buried in snow. We passed columns of prisoners, German soldiers with their hands on their heads, guarded by American MPs who looked bored rather than triumphant. On New Year's Day, 1945, we finally crossed back into German lines near Sankt Vith. Of my original 80 men, 37 made it back. Of my 6 tanks, 0. The final collapse came faster than even I had imagined. By mid-January, the Ardennes offensive was over, completely crushed. We had not reached Antwerp. We had not split the Allied armies. We had not changed anything except to waste our last reserves and open the door for the Soviets to drive deeper into Germany from the east. The Americans did not even seem particularly impressed by their victory. To them, it was just another battle, another problem solved with overwhelming material superiority. I learned later that they called it the Battle of the Bulge, a name that made it sound almost comical, like something temporary. And as I was reassigned to a makeshift battle group defending the Rhine River. We had no tanks, little ammunition, and soldiers who were either too young or too old to fight effectively. The Americans crossed the Rhine in March, and there was nothing we could do to stop them. I remember standing on the eastern bank, watching their pontoon bridges going up, watching their endless columns of vehicles crossing, and thinking back to that moment in the Belgian forest. That moment when I stood surrounded by 50,000 gallons of captured fuel and understood that we had already lost. Everything since then had just been the slow process of accepting reality. The war ended for me on April 15th, 1945. When American infantry surrounded our position near Dusseldorf and we surrendered without firing a shot, I spent the next 2 years in a prisoner of war camp in France, and then I went home to a Germany that no longer existed. My city was ruins. My family was scattered or dead. The country I had fought for had committed crimes so monstrous that I could barely comprehend them. And sometimes Night, I think about those fuel drums in the Belgian forest. I think about how we celebrated capturing them, how we thought we had seized some great prize, when all we had really done was demonstrate the impossible distance between German desperation and American abundance. I am an old man now. The war has been over for decades. I have built a new life, raised children who know nothing of tanks or fuel depots or the sound of artillery in frozen forests. But I remember that morning, December 22nd, 1944, standing in that clearing, understanding with perfect clarity that Germany was doomed. Not because of any particular battle or strategic mistake, but because we were fighting enemies who could afford to. Leave 50,000 gallons of fuel sitting in a forest with minimal guards. We were fighting nations whose production capacity was so vast that what meant survival to us was merely an accounting line item to them. That was the real lesson of the Ardennes offensive. Not that Hitler's plan was flawed, though it was not that our soldiers fought bravely, though they did, but that Germany had entered a war it could never win, against opponents whose resources made victory impossible. The fuel depot haunts me still. Sometimes I dream about it, those drums stacked in perfect rows, my men celebrating around them, and me standing alone, understanding what they could not see, understanding that we were already defeated, that the war was already over, and that all the courage and sacrifice in the world could not overcome the fundamental mathematics of industrial warfare. 50,000 gallons. A fortune to us. A footnote to them. That was the entire war in miniature. The prisoner of war camp near Lyon was not the worst place I could have ended up. I have heard the stories from men who surrendered to the Soviets, and I know how fortunate I was to have raised my hands to Americans instead. But fortune is a relative term when you spend 2 years behind barbed wire, watching your youth drain away while the world rebuilds itself without you. The Americans were correct, even generous by the standards of warfare. We had enough food to survive, medical care for the sick, and they did not beat us or work us to death. But every day in that camp was a reminder of what I had seen in that Belgian forest. The abundance, the casual waste, the impossible gap between their world and ours. The American guards would throw away food that we would have fought over. They had cigarettes, chocolate, coffee, things we had not seen in years, and they traded them carelessly or simply discarded them. I watched one guard pour out half a cup of coffee because it had gone cold, and I wanted to weep. Not for the coffee, but for what it represented. Germany had torn itself apart, had sacrificed an entire generation, had descended into madness and genocide, all while fighting enemies who could afford to pour out cold coffee. The mathematics of it was obscene. We never had a chance. Not in 1944, not in 1943, probably not even in 1941 when we invaded the Soviet Union and thought we were invincible. In the camp, I met other officers from the Ardennes offensive. We would gather in the evenings, smoking cigarettes bought with our labor credits, and we would talk about what had happened. Some of them still believed the offensive could have worked if only this or that had gone differently. If the weather had stayed bad longer, if Patton had not turned his army north so quickly, if we had captured Best. But I would shake my head and tell him about the fuel depot. I would describe standing there among 50,000 gallons, watching my men celebrate, and knowing with absolute certainty that we were doomed. Most of them did not want to hear it. They needed to believe that we had lost because of bad luck or poor decisions, not because the outcome had been inevitable from the start. There was one officer, a Hauptmann named Fischer, who had commanded a Panzer Grenadier battalion, who understood. He had been at Falaise in Normandy when the Americans closed the pocket and destroyed Army Group B, he told me about, watching American artillery pound German positions for hours, shells falling with such density that the earth itself seemed to liquefy. He said he counted over 1,000 enemy aircraft in a single afternoon, and that was just what he could see from his small sector. We were fighting the future, he said one night, his voice quiet and sad. They had turned war into an industrial process, and we were still thinking like it was 1914. Men in courage against machines and production. There was never any doubt how that would end. I was released in the summer of 1947. They gave us some civilian clothes, a small amount of money, and put us on trains heading east into what was left of Germany. I remembered the journey through France, seeing towns and villages that were already rebuilding, cranes on the horizon, new construction everywhere. Then we crossed into Germany, and it was like entering a different planet. Cologne was ruins, Frankfurt was ruined. Every city we've passed through was a landscape of broken stone and twisted metal. The destruction was so complete that I could barely recognize streets I had walked as a young man. This was what we had bought with our courage and sacrifice. This was the price of fighting a war we could not win. My family home in Dusseldorf no longer existed. The entire street had been flattened by bombing. I found my mother living in the basement of a partially destroyed building, sharing space with 4 other families. She was 52 years old and looked 70. My father had died in the war, not in combat, but from a heart attack during an air raid in 1943. My younger brother had been killed on the Eastern Front at Kursk, thrown into battle at 17 years old with 3 weeks of training. My sister had survived, but her husband had not, and she was raising 2 children alone in the ruins. This was my family's accounting of the war. 2 dead, all of us scarred, our lives shattered, our city destroyed. And for what? For 50,000 gallons of fuel we captured and lost in a single morning. The guilt came later, not immediately. At first, I was just trying to survive. Germany in 1947 was a desperate place. There was not enough food, not enough housing, not enough work. The black market ruled everything. I worked construction, hauling rubble, rebuilding the same cities we had once defended. It was hard labor, and I was not accustomed to it, but I was young enough and strong enough to manage. At night, I would lie on my cot in the crowded room my mother and I shared, and I would think about the war, about the decisions that had led us there, about my own complicity in the machinery of destruction, because that was the question that haunted me more than any other. I had not been a Nazi. I had never joined the party, never attended the rallies, never raised my hand in that obscene salute except when military protocol required it. I had been a professional soldier, or so I told myself. I had fought for Germany, not for Hitler. But what did that distinction mean when the war I fought enabled crimes beyond comprehension? I had not known about the concentration camps, not the full truth of them, but I had known enough. We all had known enough. The whispers, the rumors, the Jewish families that disappeared from our neighborhoods. We had chosen not to look too closely, not to ask too many questions. And that choice made us guilty, even if we never personally pulled the trigger in those terrible places. In 1948, the Nuremberg trials were still ongoing, and the details were emerging in newspapers and radio broadcasts. The systematic murder of 6 million Jews, the gas chambers, the death camps, the medical experiments, the complete industrialization of genocide. I read these accounts and felt physically sick, not just at the crimes themselves, but at the recognition that I had been part of the same military machine that had enabled them. My tanks, my guns, my soldiers had helped create the security and space for those camps to operate. We had been the shield behind which the SS did its work. This knowledge was heavier than any burden I had carried during the war. I met my wife, Anna. In 1949, she was working as a nurse in the hospital where I had been taken after a construction accident, a broken arm from falling debris. She was 23, 8 years younger than me, and she had survived the war by being smarter and luckier than most. Her family was from and she had lost her parents and 2 brothers to the firebombing in 1943. We recognized something in each other, a shared understanding of loss and survival. We married 6 months after we met, not out of great romance, but out of the practical need for companionship in a broken world. Love came later, slowly, built on shared silences and unspoken understanding. We had 3 children, 2 daughters, and a son. I never told them about the war, not the real war. Not what I had done or seen or understood. When they asked, which was rarely, I would give them the sanitized version. I was a tank officer. I fought in France and Belgium. I was captured by the Americans and spent time in a POW camp. The end. I never told them about the fuel depot, about standing there and knowing we were doomed. I never told them about the men I had killed or the men who had died under my command. I never told them about the guilt that woke me up at night, sweating and afraid, reaching for weapons I no longer carried. Germany rebuilt itself with remarkable speed. The Marshall Plan brought American aid, American money, American efficiency. By the mid-1950 SE, the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle, was in full swing. There were jobs, new buildings, consumer goods in shop windows. The ruins were cleared away, paved over, built upon. It was as if the country had decided to simply forget what had happened and move forward into a prosperous future. Most people embraced us. They wanted to forget, They wanted to pretend that Nazi years had been some kind of aberration, something that had happened to Germany rather than something Germany had done to itself in the world. But I could not forget. Every time I saw American products in German stores, every time I read about NATO and the alliance between West Germany and the United States, every time I filled my car with gasoline, I thought about that depot in the Belgian forest. I thought about the fundamental imbalance that had doomed us from the start. Germany had tried to conquer Europe and challenge the combined industrial might of America. Britain and the Soviet Union simultaneously. It was insanity, dressed up in uniforms and pageantry and nationalist rhetoric. And we had followed that insanity all the way to destruction because we were trained to obey, because we were told it was our duty, because questioning orders was unthinkable. In 1964, I was working as a manager in a machine parts factory in Dusseldorf. Good job, decent pay, respectable position. One day, a group of American businessmen visited the factory, potential clients looking to establish trade relationships. I was assigned to show them around, to explain our production processes, to demonstrate German efficiency and quality. Their leader was a man named Robert Harrison, about my age, friendly and professional. During lunch, we got to talking, and it emerged that he had served in the war as well. Tank Battalion Commander, 3rd Armored Division. He had fought in the Ardennes Offensive on the other side of the line from me. We compared notes carefully, neither of us wanting to dredge up painful memories, but both unable to resist the pull of shared experience. He told me about Christmas 1944, about the desperate fighting around Bastogne, about the relief when Patton's divisions broke through. Then he mentioned something that made my hands go cold. His battalion had been tasked with recapturing a fuel depot near Stavelot that had been temporarily seized by German forces. They had arrived on Christmas Day to find it completely destroyed, burned to ashes by their own air force. He laughed as he told the story, said it was typical military confusion, the right hand not knowing what the left was doing, 50,000 gallons up in smoke, he said, shaking his head. Quartermaster was furious, but honestly, it didn't matter much. We had plenty more. I excused myself and went to the bathroom. I stood at the sink, gripping the edges, staring at my reflection in the mirror. 20 years had passed since that morning in the Belgian forest. 20 years of rebuilding, working, raising a family, trying to forget. And here was an American, a man who had been my enemy, casually confirming everything I had understood in that moment of terrible clarity. It did not matter much. They had plenty more. That was the entire war in 6 words. That was why Germany had lost, why we had never had any real chance of winning. Not because American soldiers were better, though they were good. Not because American generals were smarter, though some were, but because America had so much of everything that losing 50,000 gallons of fuel was merely an inconvenience. I returned to the lunch and finished the meeting professionally. The Americans placed their order, and my factory fulfilled it. And that was the beginning of a business relationship that lasted for years. But I never forgot that conversation. Harrison and I became something like friends, exchanging letters occasionally, meeting when business brought him to Germany. He never knew that I was a German officer who had captured and lost his fuel depot. I never told him what would have been the point. The war was over. We were allies now, partners in the Cold War against the Soviet Union. The past was past, supposedly, but the past is never really past. It lives in us, shapes us, haunts us. In 1968, my son came home from university with long hair and radical ideas. He was part of the generation that had grown up in prosperity, that had no memory of the war, that looked at their parents and asked uncomfortable questions. Why did you follow Hitler? How could you not know about the camps? Why didn't you resist? He would sit at our dinner table and accuse me, accuse his mother, accuse all of our generation of cowardice and complicity. And he was right. That was the terrible thing. He was absolutely right. One night, after a particularly heated argument, I finally told him. I told him about the war, not the sanitized version, but the truth. I told him about the fuel depot, about understanding that Germany was doomed and continuing to fight anyway. I told him about the men I had commanded. Boys, really. Most of them dead now, for nothing. I told him about the retreat, the surrender, the prison camp, the guilt. I told him that I had followed orders, even when I knew they were leading to destruction, because I was a coward, because I was afraid, because it was easier to obey than to resist. When I finished, there were tears running down my face. The first time I had cried since the war. My son sat there, quiet for a long moment. Then he said something I have never forgotten. At least, he said, at least you understand what you did. Most of your generation doesn't even have that. It was not forgiveness. He could not forgive me, and I would not have wanted him to. But it was acknowledgement. It was the beginning of a conversation that my generation had been avoiding for 20 years. That conversation is still ongoing, will probably continue for generations, about guilt and responsibility and the danger of following leaders who promise greatness through violence. I am 81 years old now. The year is 2000, a new century, a new millennium. Germany is reunified, prosperous, democratic, a respected member of the international community. My children are grown with children of their own. I've lived to see my country transformed from the ruins of 1945 into something I could never have imagined. The European Union, former enemies bound together by trade and shared values, German and French children studying together, German and American troops serving side by side in NATO. It is miraculous in its way that we found a path back from the abyss. But I still think about that morning in December 1944. I still see those fuel drums, stacked in rows, American markings bright in the snow. I still feel that moment of clarity, understanding with perfect certainty that Germany was doomed. Not because of any particular battle or strategic error, but because we were fighting nations whose abundance made our desperation irrelevant. That image has stayed with me for 56 years. It probably will stay with me until I die, because it was the moment when the scales fell from my eyes, when I could no longer pretend that courage and sacrifice could overcome fundamental reality. The young people today, my grandchildren, they cannot understand. They have grown up in peace and prosperity. They cannot imagine a world where entire cities are destroyed, where millions die, where nations tear themselves apart in pursuit of insane ideologies. Sometimes I am grateful for that. Let them live in innocence. Let them take for granted the comfortable world we have built from the ruins. But sometimes I worry, because if we forget how easily civilization can collapse, how quickly ordinary people can become complicit in extraordinary evil, then we are doomed to repeat the same mistakes. So I tell this story not often, and not too many people, but I tell it about the day I captured 50,000 gallons of American fuel and realized Germany was doomed. About standing in a Belgian forest clearing, surrounded by jubilant soldiers who thought we had won something, while I understood we had already lost everything. About the terrible mathematics of industrial warfare, where courage and skill are rendered meaningless by the scale of productive capacity. About the guilt of fighting for an evil cause, even if you did not personally commit the worst crimes. About the long, slow process of trying to build something better from the ashes of catastrophic failure. This is my testimony. This is my confession. This is my warning. War is not glorious. It is not romantic. It is not a test of national character or military virtue. It is an industrial process of destruction, and in modern warfare, the side with more factories will win. Germany learned this lesson at a cost of millions of lives and the complete destruction of our country. I learned it personally on a cold December morning in 1944, standing among fuel drums that represented both our temporary success and our inevitable doom. I pray that future generations will learn it without having to pay the same terrible price. The fuel depot still haunts my dreams. Some nights I am there again, young and cold, watching my men celebrate while I understand what they cannot see. Other nights, I am older, standing in the same clearing, but it is empty now, peaceful, the snow unmarked by war. And I wonder if I am standing on the exact spot where I had my revelation, where I saw the future clearly and could do nothing to change it. History has its pivots, its turning points, its moments of clarity. For me, it was December 22nd, 1944, in a Belgian forest. For Germany, it was the entire war, the entire Nazi period, the entire descent into madness that cost us everything we valued and taught us lessons we should never need to learn again. I do not ask for forgiveness. I do not deserve it. I was a soldier in an evil cause, and the fact that I eventually understood its evil does not absolve me of my participation. But I offer my story as a warning and a lesson. Question your leaders. Question your orders. Question the narratives that promise glory through violence. And remember that in war, the truth is often visible to those willing to see it. Standing there among 50,000 gallons of captured fuel, I saw the truth. Germany was doomed. The war was lost. All the sacrifice that followed was pointless waste. I saw this with perfect clarity, and I continued fighting anyway because I was trained to obey and afraid to resist. That is the real lesson, not the strategic details or the tactical failures, but the human failure to act on uncomfortable truths. That failure costs millions of lives. May we never repeat it.